Landscape photography is more than just showing up to beautiful places and taking pictures. I mean, of course, that's the thing we love doing the most. Who wouldn't want to be in a beautiful location and have the ability and the wherewithal and the equipment and the right timing to take beautiful pictures? That's kind of what we're here for. I mean, this is what we live for. But great photographs, great landscape images come from really a three-step process. One is pre-planning. The first, before you even leave the house, where are you going to go? What conditions do you expect to see? What's the weather going to be like? Where's the sun going to rise? Where's the sun going to set? What does the location look like? What is the whole scene, and what can you expect to see when you get out there? What is the goal for going to the location you're going to? So I will spend a lot of time in the house, going to, say, Google Earth to take a look at some images that are local there, going to PhotoPills or the photographer's ephemeris and getting a sense of sunrise and sunset. I might take a look at the tide charts. I'll take a look at the weather to see if we're going to get some clouds or if we're going to get fog or what the conditions might be like. I also will spend quite a bit of time kind of getting a sense of what is the conditions like when we get out there. Is it going to be warm? Is it going to be cold? Is it mountainous? What can I expect in terms of the topography when I get onto a location? So there's all sorts of things to be aware of before you even leave the house. And then before I leave the house, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get my camera equipment ready. So my battery is going to be charged. My camera settings are going to be such that when I arrive on scene, I'm going to be ready to shoot pretty quickly. I'm going to have all the right equipment, the right lenses, all of that stuff. I'm going to have all of that stuff ready before I even leave the house. So the pre-planning part of landscape photography, A, it takes a lot of time, and B, it's really essential so that when you get out in the field and you're doing the thing that we love to do most, you just don't have to fumble around with a whole bunch of stuff. You're ready to go. Your time in the field has to be quite deliberate and to some degree a bit scientific. It isn't just taking your camera out and hitting the shutter and taking pictures and moving on. That's what we're going to spend some time on now, because it actually is quite nuanced, and you really have to have a pretty good understanding of not only how your camera works, but what you're thinking about in post-processing and how you plan on processing the image when you get back. That kind of helps dictate what's happening in the field. So let's spend some time talking about your activities in the field as a landscape photographer now. Those of you that follow me out on social media, you have heard me talk about this concept of collecting assets in the field. Now, this is a term that I first learned about a couple of years ago while shooting in Death Valley with a landscape photographer named John Barclay. Now, John actually learned this from somebody else, and I can't remember who he learned it from. So, John, if you are watching this video and you want to comment below as to who the real source of this is, please do so. I don't mean to snub that person, but John taught me this idea of collecting assets, which is the idea that we aren't out here just taking our cameras out and taking pictures. We are actually collecting data, and that data comes in the form of light that then is going to be collected by our sensors and saved to our cards. Now, that is not, I readily agree, that is not super sexy, right? That is not the thing that we all are thinking about when we're out here. We're mostly thinking about, my goodness, what a beautiful place that we are. How lucky are we to be able to photograph this? All of the things. But really, what we're doing is we are collecting data. We're collecting assets in the field so that when we go back to the house, we have the right data in order to create the final image that we want to create. One of the important reasons to think about collecting assets in the field is light. Now, it is really sunny right now, and that is great for me right now because it's a beautiful day to be outside. But it's a really tough day for my camera. You might notice I'm very bright on this side of my face, but the other side is quite dark, and the shadows on this side. And my camera just doesn't have the ability to manage the dynamic range from the brightest brights to the darkest darks. My eyes can do that really well, but my camera just doesn't have the ability to do so. So, well, there's not a lot we can do with this scene because the light is just too harsh. When we're getting up in the morning or we're going to shoot sunset, one of either or, we are often faced with times when we have really bright skies and really dark foregrounds. And so that's a time when we can collect assets in a way that allows us to extend the dynamic range of our image beyond what our camera can do. And that's called bracketing. In order to understand how to manage light really well out in the field, you need to understand the histogram on the back of your camera. The histogram is going to show you the relative value of light that's entering your camera for that scene that you're taking. From left to right, it's going to have your darkest darks, and then all the way to the right, it's going to be your brightest whites. And the relative ups and downs of the graph are going to tell you. So if you have a graph that peaks on the left-hand side of your histogram, that means you probably have a relatively underexposed image. If you have one that peaks over to the right, you have one that's maybe a little bit overexposed. The key to a histogram is the extreme left and the extreme right. Those are called the walls. And you really don't want any of your data to be bumped up against the walls, especially to the far right. So those are the bright whites. If you end up bumping up against the walls to the right, you're going to end up with bright whites that you have a really difficult time recovering in post-process. In other words, there's no data there for you to be able to recover, so those bright whites are going to remain super bright in your final image. Same thing if you're up against the wall on the left-hand side, those are going to be super dark and you can't recover any data from there. I will say, however, if you're up against the wall on the left-hand side, having some darks sometimes does create depth in your image, and so people aren't necessarily too worried about being too far on the left a whole lot. That being said, you really don't want to be bumping up too much against the left hand and the right hand. Okay, so now that we've talked about all of these things, let's go into my studio and talk about how this all comes together in post-processing. So again, 3 parts of landscape photography: the planning, the asset collection in the field, and then post-processing. So I'm going to use an image that I actually took yesterday down in Chatham, Massachusetts. The most beautiful sunrise I think I've seen in a long, long time. And it was such that the skies were very bright. The foreground was quite dark, so I bracketed 3 shots, one a little bit underexposed, one a little bit overexposed, and one correctly exposed. We're going to post-process those in a way that ends up with a correctly exposed image in the end, one with a much more balanced histogram than I would have been able to do otherwise.
So you've done the hard work of planning and preparation. You've gone out into the field and you've executed your shots. And you now come back to your studio with cards full of data. You've collected all of the assets you've needed to collect to now bring back to the studio for post-processing. Now, at this point, I want to remind us that these 3 pieces that I've been talking about, planning, execution, and post-processing, are all very dependent upon one another. If you don't plan well, it's really hard to execute. If you don't execute well and collect all the data that you need to collect, it's really hard to do good post-processing. And if you don't post-process well, you could have done everything right up until, and unfortunately, you could still end up with an image that just isn't as impactful as it could have been. So the 3 pieces together really depend upon one another, and they're very interdependent upon one another. Now, I'm not going to go through my entire post-processing workflow here. But what I do want to do is I want to talk about some images that I collected out in Chatham, Massachusetts last week, and how being mindful of collecting assets last week in Chatham helped me in my post-processing to create the image, hopefully, that is as impactful as it could be. So let's go ahead into Lightroom and take a look at that now. Okay, we've shifted over into Lightroom at this point. And to illustrate this concept of collecting assets in the field and the importance of collecting assets in the field, what I would like to do is talk about this image that I created in Chatham, Massachusetts last week. Chatham is down on Cape Cod. It's, if you know Cape Cod at all, it's the elbow of the Cape Cod, or where Cape Cod turns to go north towards Provincetown. And we were staying there for a couple of days. And I had done all of my pre-planning. I had studied the area. I knew that I wanted to get, and I'll talking about this, I'll pop up the final image. I knew that I wanted to get a shot in the dunes, and just super hopeful that I was going to have a beautiful sunrise to complement the scene in the dunes, which thankfully I had one morning. But I had studied the area. I knew what I wanted to do. I knew where I wanted to go. I kind of had an understanding of what I was going to be able to see. I actually went to this location the day before to scout it out a little bit more in person to get a sense of what this area looked like. So I had a sense of, you know, the dunes and the paths and the rickety old fences and whatnot. And so when I got up the next morning and had this beautiful sunrise, I was pretty much ready to go. My camera was ready. The settings were where they needed to be. And I had a good sense of the location and what I wanted to do when I was there. So all of my pre-planning had been done, and now it's just a matter of going out and executing. And if you remember, we were talking about, when we talk about execution, talking about this concept of collecting assets. And I knew in a case like this that just a traditional shot was going to be really difficult to have enough data to come back to my studio with because of the wide dynamic range, the brighter sky, the darker foreground. So I ended up taking 3 bracketed shots, one underexposed, one properly exposed according to the camera, and one just slightly overexposed. If I pull up the properly exposed image, you kind of get a sense of what are the challenge here. And the challenge is the relatively bright sky with the foreground being relatively dark. In order to get the foreground to really kind of come alive a little bit, you end up blowing out the sky. And to really get the colors of the sky, you end up completely darkening the foreground. But this concept of collecting assets and bracketing means that if I have the correct sky, as I would here, with the correct foreground, and I'm using correct in quotes, that you see here, I can then come back into the studio and blend the sky with the foreground to create the final image, which very accurately mimics what I was able to see there. Because if you remember right, my eyes, or your eyes, the human eye, can see many more levels of light than our camera can. It has a much wider dynamic range than our camera. So in order to sort of cheat that, if you will, I was able to take these 3 bracketed exposures, one below, one at, and one above exposure, and then blend the one that is below with the one that is above to create the final image you see here. Now, let's take a little bit more of a scientific look at that. If we take a look at the underexposed image, the one that gets our sky, and we move over to our histogram, we can see that we have a lot of information that is down here in the shadows. That's why we have this big spike in the histogram. And we have lots of color information in the mid-range here to more brighter colors. And this is, of course, the sky that we're looking at on the histogram. All of this here is the foreground. Now, keep in mind that there's a lot more information on the right-hand side of the histogram than there is on the left-hand side of the histogram. So I can't simply just open the shadows here because that's going to create a whole bunch of noise in the foreground. And that foreground is going to be very messy because there's not enough information for Lightroom to process it correctly, and it's going to fill that area with noise. If we come to the area that is the shot that is overexposed, you can see I have more information in the foreground and it's more visible. I get more detail because it's bumped over to the right a little bit. The problem, however, is all of those colors in the sky are way over here on the right-hand side of the histogram, and in fact bumping up against the wall. So there is lost data in the sky right here because it's all bumped up against this wall. And so it can be really difficult to recover that data. So instead of trying to recover data over here, or instead of trying to open up my shadows here and create a bunch of noise, what we end up doing is we blend the sky with the foreground. And as you can see, our final histogram is much more balanced. We're off the wall on the left, we're off the wall on the right, and we have plenty of information here in the middle to be able to work with and to manipulate as we see fit.
It would be pretty awesome to be able to say, hey, landscape photography is simple as 1, 2, 3. Planning, execution, and then post-processing. But I think we know it's much more nuanced than that, and we have to be much more mindful in our process than just 1, 2, 3. That being said, I do think if you follow these steps, planning, execution, and post-processing, that you will find that your landscape images will become more impactful, and however you measure them, probably just better overall. And I do think you'll become a stronger landscape photographer in the long run as a result of following these 3 steps. That being said, there may have been something I'd missed, and I'd love for you in the comments down below to share with us what you do in order to make your great landscapes. There's all sorts of ways to do this, and if you have something to add, by means, please add it down below. In the meantime, a like and a follow goes a long way to helping me out. I would appreciate that. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.